My name is Jeff Serenian. I'm co-founder of a law firm located in Point Pleasant, New Jersey. We represent municipalities across the state.
My name is Jocelyn Matheson. I'm council president in Chatham Borough, New Jersey, and I'm in my 6th year of serving on the Chatham Borough Council.
I'm Nick Orkadilis. I'm a longtime citizen activist, former mayor of Clinton Township in Hunterdon County, New Jersey, and the host of xmayor.com, a blog about issues like this. Jeff, what is going on with this new legislation regarding affordable housing?
This is legislation that was kept hidden from the public in the face of 4 Supreme Court decisions asking the legislature to take action. And it was sprung on us on December 19th of last year. And then the Housing Committee of the Assembly had a hearing on it, voted out of committee, and said, we need to get this done in lame duck. It is legislation that completely revamps the affordable housing laws of our state. And it does so in a way that I think is really damaging to the interest of the citizens of the state. And it doesn't accomplish what it thinks it accomplished, which is higher fair share numbers means more affordable housing. It basically replaces COA, which was the entity created by the Fair Housing Act in 1985. COA had 2 functions: to make the rules and to process applications by municipalities to secure approval of their plan pursuant to those rules.
By COA, you mean the Council on Affordable Housing?
The Council on Affordable Housing. And so now with the bill, what we have is the Department of Community Affairs is going to issue a report, and that report's going to tell everyone what their number is. And then there's the program is this entity that's being created of 2 to 7 retired judges that are going to process applications for plan approval and resolve disputes when developers sue and say, you should have included my site.
So you say it was hidden. By who and why, do you think?
I think it was hidden because they didn't want to give the public an opportunity to understand the bill and meaningfully comment on the bill, and they wanted to ram it through before they could wake up. That was the intent.
So who's they, the legislature? Or?
The legislature.
Interesting.
Was by design. You know, I was looking for this bill. Where is it? Where is it? And even when they announced it, they didn't release it. They released it less than 24 hours before that housing committee met.
Jocelyn, how do you think this will affect towns like yours?
Well, I would say that affordable housing overall is a challenge that every town has to deal with. And we have a constitutional requirement to allow for affordable housing to be built in our communities. And we understand that and we accept that. And I support that. But the way this law has been set up makes it extremely, extremely costly for affordable housing to be built. And I will say in a lot of communities, what you end up with is large, poor quality, 100% housing projects that are not well located, either for affordable housing, either for people who need affordable housing, or for the community as a whole.
I know that as mayor, and even now, residents ask me, why are these numbers so big? Yet they don't really seem to know how big the numbers are. So how big are the numbers really, and where do the numbers come from? Even while I was mayor, I could not figure out, no one could sit down with me and show us how they calculate these obligation numbers. Certainly the towns are not involved. They never consult with us.
There's history here. And the history is Mount Laurel 1 and Mount Laurel 2 that talked about regional need allocation. And that was incorporated into the Fair Housing Act adopted in 1985.
Sorry, what is Mount Laurel 1 and 2?
They're landmark decisions. You've heard of the Mount Laurel Doctrine. It's commonly referred to. It refers to a 1975 decision commonly referred to as Mount Laurel 1 and a 1983 decision commonly referred to as Mount Laurel 2. And these are the decisions that talked about municipalities having a constitutional obligation to create a realistic opportunity for their fair share of the need for low and moderate income households in the housing region. And so there's all these buzzwords, and when the Fair Housing Act was enacted into law in 1985, all these words were defined. And the Council on Affordable Housing who was charged with administering the Fair Housing Act and implementing the affordable housing laws of our state, created a methodology based on those rules. But what we have here with this new legislation is everything's being swept aside and it's a new day. And so we don't have to be married to regional need allocation. So they've come up with numbers, but the problem with the numbers is they're not rooted in reality. The number is based upon, they look at the 2020 census, they look at the 2010 census, they say, what's the increase in households between those two population points, or those two sources of reliable data? And then they say the prospective need is based on that. And that's how they get to the number of about 85,000 is the statewide prospective need. But the real measuring stick shouldn't be the increase in households, it's how many COs were issued in that period. There was 212,000 new households in that period, but there was only 140,000 COs issued in that period. So when you look at this 85,000, you give it a context. The best context is, well, how many COs can we anticipate?
So what you're saying,
and so 60% of the 140,000 is the number that they're projecting. It's wildly
so you're saying that
overstated.
the total number of all housing in New Jersey, not just affordable,
Yes.
is about 140,000.
Yes.
And then the obligations laid on top of towns, on top of that,
Yeah.
is another how many?
They're saying we predict 100, based on the data sources, they're saying there's going to be 140,000 COs issued between 2025 and 2035. And the obligation, the statewide obligation is 85,000. That's the obligation distributed through the state. It can be adjusted, there can be credits, there can be lots of things. But in any universe, that number is not rooted in reality, and therein lies the problem.
Didn't I see that something like 40% of residents of New Jersey actually qualify for affordable housing?
Yes, by definition.
So is affordability more than just housing in New Jersey?
Affordability, it does cover much more than just housing. And I think that something that's very important to understand is that this law only cares about housing, either apartments or purchased housing, that go through a specific, very bureaucratic program. So if this law worked as intended, 40% of residents would have to go through this very bureaucratic government program in order to get housing. And that's not a good public policy solution to a housing crisis. That there is a housing crisis. The question is, what is the appropriate response to that housing crisis? And this law is so far from what any planning expert or public policy expert or housing expert would consider a good policy response to a shortage of affordable housing.
Affordable housing is defined as a regional obligation, it's always been my understanding. And so what they do is they group counties together. I'm in Hunterdon County, for example, where we're primarily rural, very environmentally constrained, a lot of farms, prime farmland, wildlife habitat, what have you. And what they say is that we are matched up in a region. Hunterdon County is matched up as a region with Middlesex County and Somerset County. The differences between New Brunswick and the biggest town in Hunterdon County is night and day. So how they can take this regional obligation and define it by sticking counties together that are totally different from one another.
I think this legislation is a missed opportunity. I think we would all agree that we could upgrade and we could improve the affordable housing laws of our state. No one disputes there's value and there's need for affordable housing. The dispute is how to go about addressing it. And this is not the way to march forward and to address this problem. That there needs to be more thoughtful, careful thinking before this is signed into law and have dramatic impact on the citizens of our state. We're the highest tax state. We have citizens flooding out of the state. We have overdevelopment throughout the state. There's ways to produce affordable housing that don't have to create the problems that this is going to create. You know, municipalities aren't against having affordable housing, but it needs to be done in some sensible way. They would have been far wiser, in my judgment, if they gave municipalities a target they could achieve. Now they have an incentive. Okay, you know, it may be difficult, but I'm going to go do that. By overwhelming them, they're going to force a lot of municipalities to dig in. That's not productive.
Jeff, I would even argue that the model for how they do this to begin with needs to be changed. The idea that attorneys, planners, judges are going to, and our legislature will in isolation figure out how our town should grow, and that Hunterdon County should grow the same way as Middlesex County because we're so similar and we belong in one region. It's absolutely insane.
And you know, even to build on that, good planning takes a look at your infrastructure, it looks at your natural resources, it looks at your areas of need, it looks at your access to transportation, and it provides a thoughtful plan for your municipality, for your county, and for the state. And this legislation, even in its prior iteration, completely takes the affordable housing piece out of that and basically says building the maximum number of housing units trumps everything else. And as a result, what you've ended up with is towns trying to figure out how to build a whole ton of 100% residential buildings, sometimes located nowhere near where they should be located or where they're needed. It's not good planning. It's not good public policy. One other thing I wanted to mention in terms of how this affects municipalities. In my community, we have 2 affordable housing projects. The way the law forces us to do this is sort of nonsensical. So one of them is we are paying 100% for a 100% affordable housing project of 15 units. 15 units. That is projected to cost between $5 and $6 million for 15 units. So you're talking about $400,000 per unit that people will have to go through a lottery to get access to, and all their right will be to rent this affordable housing unit. And one thing that I think affordable housing experts around the world will tell you is that money in the hands of people is much more valuable than giving them a temporary in to a what's basically subsidized unit. The other example is a project that is almost 250 units. So it's a very large building of absolutely beautiful luxury apartments. I mean, I would love to live there. I toured it. It's incredible. We got 37 units of affordable housing out of that project. And that's just a drop in the bucket. But in order to make sure that the developer is paying for the housing instead of the municipality, we needed to approve a much larger project. And these are single family units that are renting for $5,000 and $6,000 a month. So how does that help the affordability issue at all? And then real quick, one last thing is that in New Jersey, municipalities cannot charge back to developers for the infrastructure and other costs associated with a development. And this has been a huge sticking point for me. I've worked in other communities in other states, and you can charge park impact fees, transportation impact fees, school impact fees, and you can get some revenue from the for-profit developer to help address the costs associated with the development. In New Jersey, that's illegal. So now we have a 250-unit building, and we get our 37 units of affordable housing, but we, as taxpayers, have to cover all of the costs for the entire building, the infrastructure, the schools, the police, et cetera.
So Jocelyn, you've queued up the elephant in the room, finally, and that's money. Where's the money going to come from? And here's what strikes me. Fair Share Housing Center is an independent, not a state agency, team of lawyers who advocate for the poor, for low and moderate income housing people. And they've been empowered by the courts to negotiate settlement deals with all the towns who have to build affordable housing. What's interesting to me is every settlement agreement that a town has done with Fair Share has wording like this in it. One of the deals Clinton Township signed says essentially that if for any reason a project being put up by a developer in Clinton Township for affordable housing loses funding or can't get HUD funding or outside federal funding, the township shall complete the project by funding the development using municipal funds.
That's a prerequisite as a matter of law for any town that relies on a 100% project.
Sure.
They have to commit to cover the gap in financing if the developer doesn't get financing or subsidies from another source.
Now, I'm not a lawyer.
That's a big number.
I'm not a lawyer. I'm a citizen and a former mayor. And what I find in the Fair Housing Act is a very simple statement. It's very simple English. Nothing in the Fair Housing Act shall require a municipality to raise or expend municipal revenues, that's tax dollars, in order to provide low and moderate income housing. So the very law itself says that towns shall not be burdened with tax revenues being spent on affordable housing. Now, I understand that given the mechanism that your town may choose to use, it may be prudent for a town to want to invest that kind of money. But when you consider these settlement deals, basically demand that a town sign a blank check for any amount of funding to cover any shortfall in any affordable housing development project.
Let me address that. The premise of the Fair Housing Act is there's language in the Fair Housing Act that says you should be able to satisfy all of your obligation with inclusionary zoning. And it makes sense. If the sin is exclusionary zoning, we've excluded low and moderate income households through our zoning policies. We should be able to solve that problem with inclusionary zoning, where you zone a site, 100 units, 20 of them are affordable, 80 of them are sold at fair market value. So the problem is that causes enormous overdevelopment. From 1985, everyone has known that causes tremendous overdevelopment. So when municipalities devise their plans, typically they have at least 100% project, because the alternative is to deluge their community. And we all know, have all felt the problems with overdevelopment. So the way that the COA got around the language in the Fair Housing Act that you're talking about is they said you could have satisfied your obligation by zoning, by traditional inclusionary zoning, 20% set-asides. You chose to do 100%. If you choose to do 100%, it's only realistic if you subsidize it. So you volunteered to do that. So we didn't violate the prohibition against making you spend your own money. But the problem is when the obligations, the numbers are so high, you run out of choices. You know, you're zoning sites, then you're developing, you're allowing them to be developed way more intensely than sound planning would dictate, and then you're relying on 100% set-asides because you don't have a choice really, and then you end up and the secret here that what the public doesn't understand is there's these bombs in all these plans throughout the state of 100% projects. There's not enough money from other sources to pay for that.
Not even close. There's not even close. And if you run the numbers, if you just say that maybe 5 or 10% of the projected affordable housing need will be covered through 100% affordable, and let's just say you take $300,000 per unit as a cost, and you run that out, you're in the billions and billions of dollars. So where are those billions and billions of dollars going to come from? Your alternative, so either you end up having to subsidize this, or you end up having to approve something that's 5 or 6 times the number of your affordable housing target. And then unfortunately right now, the way the market works is you're getting this small number of affordable units, and the rest are all very, very high-end luxury units. And one of the big policy issues that I think exists in the state, and especially in the suburbs, is the lack of workforce housing where teachers, firefighters, police officers, public servants, scientists, et cetera, can afford to live. And this ignores what's called the missing middle completely, and does not look at providing enough housing stock for them. So you have very, very high-end housing stock, and they say they need to make it luxury in order to cover the costs of the affordable. Or somehow you're supposed to come up with the money to cover this shortfall between state and federal money and how much these affordable projects are going to cost. And you have to authorize bonding for the full amount no matter what. And I can tell you, as an elected official, you have people who are very upset that you're approving projects, and then they're very upset that you are approving bonds that are increasing your debt by massive amounts. Municipalities are the most cash-strapped governments in the state. And to place these billions of dollars of burden on the municipalities is absolutely nonsensical.
So you've both drawn a very important distinction that I really don't think the public gets, at least in my experience talking to people. Inclusionary and 100% municipal. I think people don't understand that there are two mechanisms for a town fulfilling their obligation. Number one, the town can build a 100% affordable project. For example, if a town has an obligation of 100 units, they take a piece of land, the town buys it or owns it, partners with a developer, and builds all affordable housing, fulfills their entire 100% obligation, they're done. The alternative is an inclusionary project, which I think people don't understand very well. Inclusionary project means a developer comes in and says, we're going to build your 100 units for you. But the law lets us build 5 times more total units. We get a bonus. We'll build 100 affordable housing units for you and 400 more market units to help us pay for the affordables. So as Jeff is pointing out, that's what leads to sprawl and overdevelopment. Because if a town does not want to do a 100% affordable project of its own and pay for it, they're reliant on a developer who suddenly comes and basically airdrops 500 units in your town in order to fulfill a 100-unit obligation. How insane is that?
Well, there's a big price tag with inclusion. That 500-unit project, when you look at all the kids that project generates,
Right.
and the cost of educating children, and in some cases, the need to build new schools, it gets very expensive.
But don't
to do it
affordable
that
housing
way.
folks moving in pay taxes? Pay
Sure, they
property
do,
taxes?
and that ameliorates it. But typically, it doesn't cover all the cost. So if you're going to rely, so let's say you're a community, and one community relies exclusively on 100%, and the other community relies exclusively on 20%. That community that relies exclusively on 20% is going to have big burdens. It's going to have burdens on its school system. It's going to have burdens on its infrastructure. Driving from point A to point B, there's going to be a lot more people living in your town. It's going to put a lot more stress on the infrastructure.
Just as an example, in Clinton Township, a typical tax bill for a homeowner is about $10,000 to $12,000, $13,000 a year. Typical bill to educate a child in our public school system is somewhere between $16,000 and $18,000 a year. So if you have 2 kids moving into an affordable housing development, you're now costing taxpayers overall basically twice as much as they're paying in taxes. So how does a town deal with this? How do we deal with this ethically in terms of providing affordable housing?
Towns do their best. They look at, they begin with a number, and then they figure out what's the best way for me to meet that number. The problem here is the number's insane. The number's not rooted in reality. Now, if they gave them a number that they could reach, they could say, okay, we're still going to have all these burdens we're talking about, but they're going to be manageable burdens. The problem with this bill that the legislature just has not addressed is the cost. I've testified before them, and I said the issue is not, is it valuable to have more affordable housing? The issue is how much will it cost and who's paying for it? They won't answer the real question. They won't even tell you the numbers. We had to force them to do it by producing our own numbers.
But isn't it true that a lot of towns, when they negotiate their fair share number, opt to do what's called a pilot, payment in lieu of taxes, where rather than having folks who move into a development pay taxes, the developer has to put up basically a tax bond, if you will, pays a lump sum to the town rather than have the residents who are moving in pay it, with the result that the pilot fee to the town goes all to the town. None of it goes to the school district. So the school district is not only hampered now with 2 kids per unit, with only half the cost of educating them coming in through property taxes, now they have 0 revenue from property taxes because of the pilot.
So That's absolutely the case, that a lot of these projects, in order to have any influence over these projects, and in order to address some of these issues that you can't address in New Jersey by requiring the developer to make offsite improvements or address traffic issues, et cetera, a municipality will enter into a pilot agreement where the municipality gets a share of the profits from the project, and the project is exempt from taxes for 30 years. But they are extremely complex, and you have municipalities with volunteer elected officials going up against big developers with accountants and attorneys who are, being paid $1,000 an hour. So they're very much at a disadvantage in negotiating these agreements. We had a crisis of property taxes going up and up and up and up. And the policy response to that was to put a 2% cap on municipal taxes and a 2% cap on school budgets. And now the state is basically telling us that we somehow have to support all of this new development and all of the infrastructure associated with this new development and all of the school needs and public safety needs associated with this new development, and still stay at that 2%. And it just doesn't work. It really doesn't make sense.
When numbers are assigned to towns, they're always negotiated. And there's an entity the courts have empowered to negotiate with towns. It's called the Fair Share Housing Center, which acts essentially as an enforcement arm of the courts. So a town gets sued.
That's not supposed to be the way it works.
Well,
It's not supposed to be the way it works.
Fair
And they
Fair
pretend.
Fair Share Housing Center comes in and negotiates with the town for their number. As a former mayor, I've always objected to the fact that they refer to towns in New Jersey as being racist, as being exclusionary, as being NIMBY, not in my backyard. I know in my town's case, we were browbeaten not only into the number that we agreed to, but at the end of the negotiation, they demanded a $45,000 total donation, which I even question whether that's even legal. The enforcement of affordable housing, seems to me, cannot be left to an independent third party, number one. And number two, the determination of your number cannot be left to third parties, including the courts and the legislature. Towns need to be involved.
This brings up a very interesting point, because that whole world of negotiated settlements is kind of what happened in the last round after the Council on Affordable Housing became dysfunctional. So everything became negotiated with the courts, and they really got into the weeds on not just what the municipal obligation was, but how they were going to get there.
Could you just explain quickly what the Council on Affordable Housing is so people understand what we're
So
talking about?
originally, the Council on Affordable Housing was a council that was empowered and given the responsibility to sort of manage affordable housing obligations, certify that towns were complying with their affordable housing obligations.
It's actually a state agency.
Yes, as a state agency. And I believe under Governor Christie, the state agency was dissolved, or he didn't appoint any members to COA. Instead, the process moved to the courts. And that's been a nightmare. I will tell you, as an elected official, the process of it being in the courts has been incredibly difficult, incredibly expensive. It's interesting because affordable housing attorneys have made a fortune off of this, but even they are just appalled at the money wasted on attorneys and planners and all of that.
So towns used to negotiate with the Council on Affordable Housing
Yeah.
to get their numbers.
Yep.
The Council on Affordable Housing, and this bill, as a matter of fact, correct me if I'm wrong, Jeff, this bill would eliminate the Council on Affordable Housing entirely.
Yes, it abolishes it.
So,
It's a stated purpose.
so if towns can't negotiate with the state agency called COA, the Council on Affordable Housing, who do they negotiate with? Do they negotiate with the court, with the judges?
Well, you didn't negotiate with COA. COA established standards. They were a bureaucratic agency. You complied with their standards. They certified your plan. That's the way it worked. The reason why it didn't work in the period preceding Mount Laurel 4, which is a case that turned it back to the courts, is because every time they adopted rules, Fair Share Housing Center would challenge it. So they never had a stable body of regulation that they could say, this plan complies with these rules, because there were no rules, or there were rules under attack with a cloud over them.
So what I see is Fair Share Housing Center essentially inserted itself in the process and in the process got rid of the Council on Affordable
Yeah.
Housing, which benefits Fair Share Housing Center.
Yes.
Which is not a state agency.
Yes.
It's a private entity. So why would the courts assign this kind of power? Fair Share Housing Center, I believe, has negotiated settlements with
354 they
354 towns. They came in and negotiated with all these towns. I know they did it with mine. As I said, at the very end, they demanded $45,000 of a donation. Imagine being sued by someone privately, and in the end of the process, they want a donation out of your pocket because they sued you.
It's worse than you think.
Tell me about it.
We've collected 275 of the 345 settlements. We count $4 million, over $4 million.
Of what?
That towns have agreed to pay
To who?
to Fair Share Housing Center so that they don't have to litigate with them because they're good attorneys that know the law and the courts think they're the ones that are the do-gooders.
So we won't negotiate unless you give us a donation?
Well, isn't that exactly what happened to your town?
I've always likened it to The Sopranos. This is a Sopranos kind of deal. You pay us some money and we'll do a deal with you. I find that absolutely abhorrent. Yes. I'm shocked that the courts know about this and don't do anything about it.
Look, you're a municipality, and what are your choices? You can litigate with them. They're smart, they're effective. You're going to spend a lot of money. It's going to cost you a lot more than giving them whatever amount they negotiate with you.
So if I can kind of jump in here, I think it's important to recognize, again, that we all recognize that there's a housing crisis, there's a housing affordability crisis, and I will at least acknowledge that in some of our suburban communities, historically, in decades past, they have had zoning that was kind of designed to keep things exactly the way they are. And the law, the Supreme Court decided that they were intentionally trying to keep poor people out of their towns, and often the towns with the best schools. And we all acknowledge that. I will tell you that I have been a champion of diversity and economic diversity in my community, and I believe that diversity and economic diversity is a good thing. I don't think it's good for our school kids to, only kids of hedge fund managers to be going to school together. I really don't.
Forbid.
So I buy into the underlying mission of having affordable housing throughout our state, including in the affluent suburbs. But the way that this process works is incredibly wasteful, incredibly inefficient, and it doesn't lead to good development or good housing. And one of the very frustrating things that's happened, I've spent a lot of time trying to educate people, testifying. I'm a volunteer council member, and then on top of that, on my own time, I've been going down to Trenton and trying to testify, and then I will be dismissed after that as basically just an affluent suburb, representative of an affluent suburb who wants to keep poor people and minorities out of my town. And I will acknowledge that there are people with that attitude who exist in the state, but they don't speak for me and I don't speak for them. I believe in diversity and I believe in economic diversity. I believe that this law is terrible for municipalities and it's terrible for the state of New Jersey. This law was written, as far as I can tell, primarily by housing advocates, and they have one important perspective. But professional planners were not at the table. If you talk to the New Jersey chapter of the American Planning Association, they were not at the table. They're the experts in good planning and affordable housing. The municipalities who have to implement this were not at the table in the drafting of this regulation. Environmental groups, conservation groups were not at the table in implementing this legislation. And so I think that what we really need to do is take a deep breath, step back, and have all of these different entities at the table to craft legislation that will be effective and efficient at meeting our state's affordable housing needs.
Now, there's the only solution that I've heard that is bottom up, makes sense, and it involves the stakeholders. It's the only way to look at this. The stakeholders, it's a bottom up process. If you do it honestly and intelligently, using good data, good science and planners, the solution to me, and again, I'm a former mayor, I believe what you're saying is really the proper solution. Jeff, maybe from a legal standpoint, you might say it a little bit differently. What is the solution?
I agree with Jocelyn. If you could put a blue ribbon panel together and try to think through this logically. And you're right, you have to have all the stakeholders at the table.
Wouldn't they also get more buy-in? Wouldn't they get more buy-in rather than
You know
complaining
what was
from towns?
interesting is when the Fair Housing Act was signed into law in 1985, both sides of the aisle said, this has to be bipartisan or this will never work.
Yes.
That's what they said.
And it's never been.
It's quoted throughout the transcripts of the hearings when when the Fair Housing Act was signed into law. This was done from one side, shoved down the throat of the other side. That doesn't promote that we're in this together and we're going to do something together on this.
So what can citizens do at this point? The bill is in between committee right now on an actual vote.
The bill was
Thursday?
voted out of committee, the Senate Budget and Appropriations Committee yesterday, and it's going to the Senate on the Senate floor on March 18th.
On March 18th. So
So
what can people-
the public can tell their legislators, hold up, let's rethink this. Now, one of the things about solutions that we've proposed that we think would help root this law into reality is you should be able to comply with inclusionary zoning where there's 4 market units to generate 1 affordable unit. That only works to the extent that there's a market for the 4 market units. So what do we really predict? You can do a market study.
Talk about profit, right?
No. You can evaluate what will the market, how many units will the market demand? Because if it doesn't demand it, the developers aren't going to build it. And if you base the number, and if you have a number that's based upon what do we predict will be the number of units that will be constructed in the state divided by 5, that's your number. You can satisfy it by zoning sites and have and complying that way, or you can take a chance of doing 100% set aside and try to do it that way. Now, the state, to its credit, has put hundreds of millions of dollars into 100% set asides, but it's not enough. It's a stone in the ocean. It's not enough by many, many millions. So the net impact of the bill, if you really understand this and you think down the road, it's going to put an enormous burden on the taxpayers of an overtaxed state, and it's going to promote overdevelopment. It's going to a match to a gasoline can.
All I would add as a semi-rural county is that we also need to consider constraints on what the land can actually support.
Absolutely.
So what citizens can do is contact the legislators and tell them they want a more reasonable, bottom-up based plan that can deliver affordable housing the state needs without upsetting the apple cart, turning New Jersey, which is the garden state, into something else entirely.
To the Garden's apartment state.
Garden apartment state, which would be more affordable overall.
Yeah, I mean, and ultimately, the people who pay the price are low and moderate income households.
Yeah.
Taxes go up.
Yeah.
Guess who gets hurt the most?
Bingo. Thanks for sitting down and talking about this, folks. This has been really illuminating.
Thank you very much.
I hope the public finds it that way.